Well, thank you, Chair. Thanks for introducing me. I'll probably tell you a little bit more about myself. That I have worked in the City of London and in various commercial banks and investment banks in the heart of the evil father in the Garden of Eden, working with them to make it a better world for us all, in various banks, including ones that are commonly mentioned in the press as either being blood-sucking vampires and so on. And in that environment, I can tell you, over the last 35 years, I'm not working there now, the idea of the European Union, at least in London, was regarded with a great deal of enthusiasm. And the reason for that is simply that they saw in particular the relationship between Britain and the European Union as being absolutely key. Because all the big American banks who came over in the late 1980s and early 1990s to occupy Canary Wharf and various other parts of the city, their reason for coming over was because of the opening up of Britain for business, for the movement of the stock markets and bonds, for foreign exchange, to turning Britain into a financial free-for-all. And that basis of that for the American banks is then to be able to go into Europe to invest and to play a role in getting profits out of the development of the European Union. Britain was key to that because it was an English language, it's right on the Greenwich Mean Time, and it had the traditions of a long historical role for the financial sector. So it was key to the process of the development of the European Union in its later stages. But if I could just go back a while, because it's now 70 years since we've had, in a way, the first starts towards the development of European Union integration, starting with the common market, when a small group of European countries, capitalist countries, came together in order to break down the barriers they had on tariffs and other trade so that they could trade freely. And then moving on to what we're all now aware of, apparently in Britain, about customs union. Then we moved on to a customs union where the regulations and everything were harmonized so that you could move goods and capital around the area without having to continually check on it. It was all harmonized in such a way. That took place 70 years ago. And it's developed eventually into a political project. And it always was originally a political project. The purpose, as I think the chair mentioned to begin with, of the European Union, as it eventually became with the Treaty of Rome, was to provide a new pole for capital in the center of the world, on the one hand against American imperialism, and on the other hand of rising Japanese and Asian capitalist economies. Europe was the leaders of European capital, although linked and relying upon the armed defenses of American imperialism, wanted to develop a separate capitalist pole led by France and Germany, and to develop that eventually with its own trading area and its own development to compete against American imperialism and growing Asian imperialism as well, represented at that time by Japan and later on by the new industrial Asian economies. So it was a major political project. It was political also for one reason that has been mentioned, is that the purpose of that was to unify European capital so that no longer will be a battle within European capital over who should rule and who should rule in the world, but actually should be a degree of unity and integration to ensure that they can compete worldwide. And we'd have to say that from the period of the early development of that common market up to the point of the European Union and onwards, in some ways it was a relative success. It brought together 12, 15 countries with common trading, common customs union, and inevitably that increased the ability of some countries to come from nowhere and move forward. And if you look at the data, and I've looked at the data over and over again, from the period of about the 70s up until the late 80s, most European countries improved their productivity, and there was a degree of convergence between the most well-developed, like Germany and Northern Europe, and the Southern European countries, particularly after the revolutions in Portugal and Spain and Greece, the overthrow of Bonapartist and fascist regimes, and the coming into the European Union. Greece was very late, too late, but the others came in earlier, and they gained from this trading area. Their small capitalist economies gained from these trading areas and went forward. But that was also the period when capitalism had a reasonable degree of growth, not just in Europe, but internationally as well. And that began to change by the middle of the 1970s and onwards, and we entered what Simon has correctly described as a whole new period, which we now, at least in academic circles, called neoliberalism. I don't suppose any working class or movement knows what the hell that means. But it simply means, as far as I'm concerned, it's pretty simple, that no longer did you rely upon a welfare state, developing a welfare state, decent public services, decent health service, decent education, using the state to try and take the economy forward and develop technology. Quite the opposite. You wanted to slash the state. You wanted to destroy the public services. You wanted to hold down wages. You wanted to privatize those sectors that are out of the control of capitalism. Why? Why did that happen? Why did neoliberalism happen? See, I don't think it was because of the EU. Neoliberalism existed throughout the major capitalist economies. The EU obviously was part of that. The reason was that capitalism was no longer succeeding in developing productive forces, was no longer delivering enough profit. Workers, they could no longer afford the welfare state, and they were forced to try and reverse the process and the gains that had been made in the post-war period immediately afterwards, up to the mid-60s and the early 70s. And then we had the political leaders behind that process of reversing the policy of the previous 2 decades, the Thatchers, the Reagans, and so on, also to some extent across Europe as well. So neoliberalism was an international regime or policy, that ideology that developed in order to restore the profitability and control of capitalism and reduce the influence of the labor movement and the state internationally. That was the purpose of neoliberalism. Simon's described how effective it's been in a very important area like housing, probably the most effective area, because in many ways housing has never had an opportunity to develop it grounds on a basis of what's in the interests of the services, of decent public services, at least not in the UK. The UK is an epitome of neoliberal capitalism and always has been in relation to its close connections with the US. But what we have here was a change in the environment. No longer was the European Union and this common market successfully converging and bringing countries together and improving their conditions. In fact, it was beginning to go in the opposite direction. There was a divergence. And that was crucially established when the European Union leaders, the capitalist leaders, the Franco-German leaders, Schmidt and, was it Mitterrand or was it the other Frenchman? I can't remember which president it was, met in a little road and decided that they were going to move on to the next stage of integration, which was to develop a single currency, the euro, to take the integration of European capital further with a single currency, a single central bank interest rate, and to converge as best they could debt and fiscal control in this European economy. What's very interesting about the Eurozone convergence, there was no convergence about trying to get everybody up to the same standard of living. There was no convergence about trying to get everybody up to the same employment levels. There was no conversion of everybody getting up to decent public services. Now, that wasn't part of the criteria of the Eurozone. No, because that threatened the free movement of capital, which is what the purpose of this next stage was. Yes, there was convergence over one central bank telling what everybody to do, and one single currency, which whatever the conditions were in Greece or whatever they were in Finland, you had one single currency because they wanted to, as it were, straitjacket the European Union to one unit run by Franco-German capital, whatever happened. And what you've got when you look at the data is a reversal of the previous situation. You have divergence. Then all the countries that are the weakest capitalist economies diverged, went further away from the best and most strongest countries. The strong gained and the weak lost. Surprise, that process was accelerated in this period. It was both a product of neoliberalism generally, and also the fact that the introduction of the single currency and the process that was involved in that. So we had a situation where weak capitalist economies, Greece being a good example, the Greek capitalists were desperate to get into the European Union and also into the Eurozone as a result, because the two things came together. And when they got in, of course, their purpose was, as it were, to be able to attract massive amounts of foreign investment, particularly from Germany, France, and so on. And that's what they got. They got a lot of money coming in precisely in the areas that Simon's talked about, not just Britain, but a massive growth in the residential and property markets. I looked at the figures. Usual complaint about Greece is that it didn't stop its public spending. It was out of control. But if you look at the data, actually, it's nothing. Public spending wasn't out of control in Greece. What was out of control was private credit. It rocketed up, and it mostly went into investment in unproductive areas, not even into tourism, which was supposedly Greece's great advantage, but into property and all kinds of other speculative activities. And what did the people who made profit out of that, which were the French and German banks and the Greek capitalists behind them, did the public sector get any of that? No. Taxes were reduced in Greece, as elsewhere in a neoliberal environment. In fact, the result was that, I'm sure ANTARSYA comrades will tell me, but you'll explain this, but the Greek shipping industry, which is the most famous industry in Greece, doesn't pay any tax. I mean, can you believe it? It's written into the constitution. This is before the European Union, but it's an indication of the inability to turn for the public sector to have any gain for the working class. And of course, we now know that layers and layers of the best paid and richest parts of Greece were paying no tax at all. If they weren't floating it out of the country, they were floating it in their swimming pools where they were never charged, although they were supposed to be, and all the other big houses that they had. This was the situation. So therefore, inevitably, tax revenues were falling while property prices and credit was rising dramatically. This is a total imbalance, a completely unproductive, fictitious way of taking the economy forward. And Greece was the prime example of this, and therefore the biggest fall guy. And then, everybody, what happened in 2008? We had a global financial crash. The world went down. Capitalism supposedly doing fantastic. I remember being in the boardrooms of the banks. Well, not the boardrooms, maybe, but certainly in the research institutes in 2007 and saying everything's going fantastically well. We've got all these derivatives. We're just making loads and loads of money. Nothing can go wrong. And then, well, the US housing market's looking a bit iffy. No, nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about. We macroeconomists know what's going on. Absolutely fine. Nothing to worry about. And yet, only 1 year later, just down the road at the London School of Economics, the Queen of England came to see the London School of Economics to make a visit in the depth of this huge slump that had then taken place, started off by the housing market, and then the derivatives crash, and then spreading right across the whole of the world for the first time. The whole of the world, a huge slump. So the Queen arrived, and she was greeted by the dignitaries at the door, bowing in the usual reflex manner. And the first thing she said was, "How did you know this how did you know this wouldn't happen? How did you miss this?" she said. That's the first thing she said. And they went, and they didn't answer. But 2 days later, they wrote a reply from the Royal Academy in proper writing, in which it said, I won't read it out to you because it's a bit long and boring, but the gist of it is, we have no idea why. That was the gist of it. So the leading elements in capitalist strategy didn't understand this crisis and were unable to cope with it and explain it. But the one thing they were sure about was that the people who had caused it, the banks and big business, were not going to pay for it. No, working class people were going to pay for this terrible mess. And in particular, countries like Greece and others, Portugal, Ireland, Spain to some extent, every country in Europe, the working class were asked to pay. But particularly those countries, the weakest capitalist countries, were unable to fund the huge losses that were now taking place in those economies. So the European Union now looked as a total failure. And the Eurozone looked as a total failure. And we had what was called the Eurozone debt crisis in 2012, when there were countries like Greece who were running up huge debts and couldn't pay for them, so that the bonds, the government bonds which were being issued to try and cover this, the Greek government bonds, were diving in price. Now, who had been holding all these government bonds? Well, some Greek banks and individuals in Greece, they lost money, but mostly it was foreign banks, in particular the French, German, Italian banks. And the value of the bonds that they were now holding were worth 10% of what they paid for them. They were making huge losses. There was no way that those losses could be allowed to be realized and be written off, because, you know, if you run a company and you get some money from some banker and then everything goes pear-shaped and you lose all your money, you just go bust. The banker doesn't get the money back on the whole. He can squeeze you as much as he can, but on the whole doesn't get it back. Well, no. So the Greek economy's bust. The Greek government can't pay its bill. Sorry, you're still going to have to pay the bill to the French and German banks. How? How can you do this? I'll tell you what we'll do, said the European Union leaders and the IMF and the ECB. We'll lend you the money at quite a nice rate, lower rate, and you just pay all the French and German banks back with it. Okay, so what happens with the debt that we've now got from you? Now you've got to start paying us back. Yes, we won't ask you to pay it back straight away. We'll give you time, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and it won't be at a horrible rate, but you will pay back every euro cent of it over time. And to do that, we want you to slash all your public services. We want you to slash your pensions by 40%. We want to privatize anything that the Greek government's got a hold of, sell it off, and so that you raise enough funds in order to pay us back, not to provide services and benefits for the unemployed. There are now massive unemployment in Greece and other countries. No. The money is to go in one door and then out the other door back to us over a period of time. And each time we must keep rolling this over indefinitely. Now, the Greek government debt before the Euro debt crisis was about 80 to 90% of GDP. It was quite high because, as I explained, they weren't getting any tax revenues. Currently, after this crisis and the process that took place, it went up to 176% of GDP, approximately. Since then, they had to keep paying back loans to the IMF and to paid off all the French and German banks, to the IMF primarily and the ECB, and they've been asked to keep pressure on government spending and raise taxes and do all the things I've just described in order to run a surplus on the budget. What is the debt to GDP now in the last 5 years since they were told to do all this in a heavy way? It's 180% GDP. It hasn't gone down at all. It's going to be there forever. I think I've worked it out, that the next 3 generations of Greeks will still be paying for this. This is an indication of how terrible this situation has come. Now, this situation, in my view, is not necessarily a product of the European Union as the great evil, or even the Eurozone. Both the European Union and the Eurozone could well have ploughed on if capitalism had been able to plough on. But capitalism cannot plough on indefinitely, providing things for people or being forced to make concessions. It was in a serious slump in 2008-9, and then the strategists of capital took the decision to preserve the interests of capital, which in particular is the finance sector, but also other sectors, the better off, the owners of capital, at the expense of labour and public services and so on. So whether Greece had been in the European Union in 2015 or 2012 or not, that crisis would have still happened in some form or other, as it happened in other countries. But it was a crucial moment in 2015. And I'll just remind you, next month, it's 4 years since the moment that the Greek people had a referendum. And the Greek people were asked, rather reluctantly by the leader of the Syriza government at the time, do you want to accept vicious austerity and the payment of this debt indefinitely or not. Now, that was basically what the referendum vote question was. And the campaign from Mrs. Merkel and the rest of you, don't accept this, my God, the whole world's going to go down and you'll be thrown out and there'll be no euro and everything. You'll be out in the Aegean Sea in a small boat. It's not talk about migrants coming into Greece. It'll be Greece out in the sea in a boat if you don't vote to accept this memorandum of understanding, which is basically the program of paying this debt. And so the propaganda was massive. The propaganda from the government, the Syriza government, the left government, although they called the referendum, was not very strong. What do you think? It's a difficult situation. There's a lot of debt here. On the other hand, we could be out of the euro if you don't vote for it. What do you think? We don't. You decide. For God's sake, vote yes. But they did not vote yes. By 60 to 40, the Greeks said, no, we're not going to have this austerity. We renege on the debt, if that's what it means. The Greeks also still felt that they should stay in the euro. They saw the euro and European Union as something that they wanted to stay in. They thought, because outside might just be a Greek drachma sinking down the cliff. So their idea, they didn't want to be in Argentina or a Venezuela now. Not then, Argentina was the one. But on the other hand, they didn't want to pay this debt. So it's a contradiction which capitalism has created, not the working people. Capitalism created this contradiction. People voted against it. So there was a clear vote, and there was a choice at that moment for a left government, supposedly, in Greece to make. It could have said, in my view, and it should have said, fine, Greek people have decided we are not going to pay this debt. We are not going to have this imposition on us. We're going to go to the European leaders. Forget it. You didn't force the Germans to pay their debt after the Second World War. You're not going to ask us to pay it now. And this is nothing, it's not our fault we're in this mess, despite the fact you say that all the Greeks are lazy. That's not true. But actually, by the way, the Greeks have the longest working hours in Europe. So the argument that they're lazy is ludicrous. They work the longest hours. Their productivity is low because they don't have the levels of technology and investment in the right sorts of industries. But they work long hours, mainly because they're in small businesses and all kinds of tourist industries, which mean you're working long hours, compared to German and French workers working in technology and manufacturing factories for 6 weeks holiday a year and going home at 5 o'clock, because successfully those countries have developed the technology to do so. But we're not going to pay that debt. And that position should have been taken by the Syriza government. What the leaders of the Syriza government did, in the case of the finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, was to say, well, I've been trying to persuade Mr. Schäuble to see the reasonableness of our point of view, and he doesn't seem to agree, so I'm resigning. So Yanis went off. Tsipras said, well, it's hopeless. If we don't pay the debt and we stand against it, we're going to be out of the euro. So we're going to pay the debt. We're going to accept the memorandum and we're going to vote it through Parliament. And those of you know that's what has carried. And now next 2 weeks, is it 3 weeks, we're going to have a new general election. And that policy of trying to pay the debt down, which hasn't been paid down, and to continually privatise and increase taxation and reduce the living standard of the Greek people dramatically in that period has continued over 4 years. And now the Greeks are out of the programme. In other words, they don't have to abide by the exact amount of neoliberal policies they should adopt. They're not going to choose their own neoliberal policies. That position is now happening. Tsipras has called an election where he's going to get beaten. And he's going to get beaten not by a left, not by ANTARSYA, not by any other left, not by the communists. He's not going to be beaten by any of these who oppose the policy that Tsipras had. He's going to be beaten by the Conservatives. The Conservatives are coming back. And what is the policy of the Greek Conservatives? It's to stay in the European Union and carry out more neoliberal policies. More. No, Tsipras hasn't done enough. And we've got to really turn Greece into a competitive nightmare as fast as possible by reducing the pensions further, by privatising what's not been privatised, by cutting more services that haven't been cut already in order to try and get Greece more competitive. And we're going to hope, this is the key point, we're going to hope that the rest of Europe grows fast enough so when all the tide goes up, all boats go up, even the little Greek boat, and then we'll all be better off. That's been the hope for the last 4 years, that there'll be a rise in the European growth and Greece will recover along with it. Greek capitalism will recover along with it. Well, have they? European growth has been pathetic in the last 4 years, and currently it's heading down below 1%. The ability of Greece to recover on the basis of a recovery of European capital is really out of the question. So this situation continues. And I would make the point that this is perhaps the next point to be made. Would it have been better for the Greek government to say, we're going to leave the European Union, leave the single currency, restore the Greek drachma, because it was talked about, and then carry on our own? Well, in my view, it's the same question I would pose about Britain too. What has been the cause of this mess? The cause of the mess is the failure of capitalism to deliver people's needs and conditions. A cause of this mess has been the attempt of the bankers and the owners of capital to screw labour in order to sort out their problems, to save capitalism at our expense. It's not specifically to do with whether you're in the single currency or not, because all the countries outside the single currency have had the same results. In the case of all those Eastern European ones, do you know what their solution was to this terrible downturn? Everybody left. Everybody left Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. Where did they go? They went over to Britain and Germany and elsewhere, and then this enabled Britain to have a bit of a growth because it had a massive number of immigrants coming in. Productivity in Britain's terrible, but output went up for a period of time because we had all these Eastern Europeans, mainly skilled, in single or just young, who provided new boost to the economy, filling the jobs that other people don't want to do, or where we don't have people to do them. So that transformation was, as it were, dealt with by emigration, and in Greece, massive emigration in Greece and in Spain and in Portugal and in Italy, continual flow of people out of Italy. All these countries, they flow out. That's been the way that it's been resolved. It wouldn't, in my view, have been resolved by just leaving the EU and the Eurozone. I could spend more time on this, I've probably spent too long, but I would just simply say that if you're outside the single currency and outside the EU, and you're still based on a capitalist economy with a capitalist government in control, like New Democracy in Greece, or God knows what we're going to have in the UK after October the 31st, do we really think that that is going to solve the problem if we've left the EU, even if it means that Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage is finance minister? I mean, is that the option? Because that seems to be the option we're faced with. In my view, it will be a mistake to get confused, which is what the capitalist class in Britain has attempted to do, because they're confused. They didn't know which way to go. Confuse us into thinking that the solution to the question is whether you're in, we must remain to save our day. No, we must leave because it's a capitalist club. I think both of those alternatives are far too cutting across what is going on in the capitalist system, the crisis in the system, and the fact that the class struggle is being covered over, misted over by this argument about whether you're in or out. That was the same issue in Greece in 2015, and it wasn't resolved. And it will be the same issue in 2019 in the UK if it's not resolved. The question of whether we should be in or out of Europe is, in my opinion, far less important than the question of whether we're in control of our economy and we've overthrown the basic commanding heights of the economy, taking it out of the hands of the bankers and the big business and place it in the hands of a government that's working for the people and democratically under their control. It's the socialist program that's key. And also I'll finish on this point, Chair, an international program. Greece cannot become socialist on its own. It cannot transform its future on its own. It's too small. But I have to say, neither can the UK, and neither can Germany when it comes down to developing a better society based on workers' democracy and socialist control over services and conditions meeting people's needs. It requires a socialist international perspective, uniting those countries together as a clear alternative to the capitalist perspective of the European Union. And that is the objective, it seems to me, that we have to aim for. Whether we're in or out is a diversion in some ways. And that's the point I want to make. And it can't be a dangerous diversion unless we remember the central point here is to get rid of the capitalist forces in our society, whether it's in Britain, Greece, or the European Union across the board.